Horror has been with us since the beginning of cinema. When the Lumiere brothers filmed a train pulling into its station, audiences got their first taste of the power of the shocking image. It terrified and thrilled at the same time. Silent cinema became synonymous with horror images that still live up to their power to this day. In the 1930s, Universal provided us with a set of horror icons, and Hammer took them to campy new heights in popularity in the 50s and 60s. But by the 1970s, horror was again starting to be taken seriously. After Bergman's Hour of the Wolf put horror in the art house, directors as well respected as Polanski, Roeg and Friedkin delivered masterpieces of the genre. And by the end of the 70s, the master himself turned to Stephen King's most popular novel, taking a well-loved story, breaking it down and rebuilding it right back up in his own terrifying vision. This is The Shining. Even the credit sequence is completely unnerving. As the overhead shots sweep high above the trees and we hear the first honking, menacing tones of Wendy Carlos's incredible score, we sense that something is amiss. What that something is, we don't exactly know, and I'm not sure we ever will. But as we see that car hurtling amongst the trees and those echoing, almost screams in the soundtrack, you get a sense that whoever is behind the wheel is cruising head-on into a sinister, otherworldly future. The usual warning here, everybody. Spoilers will be contained within this review, so if you've not seen The Shining, you should do what Jack, Wendy and Danny should have done, and turn back right now. On with the review. Following the credits, The Shining opens fairly straight. We follow as Jack Torrance arrives at the Overlook Hotel for an interview. He appears to be a fairly charming, good-looking guy, who walks with a confidence and carelessness, and he also appears polite as he introduces himself to the owner, Stuart Ullman, graciously accepting a cup of coffee before they commence with the interview. I think this is an important point. Many commentators on the film seem to imply that Nicholson is going full pelt from the off here, but I completely disagree. There's no doubt that there is a darkness there, and that is key of course, because as the movie progresses, we learn at least a suggestion of what may have gone before. But one of the criticisms I hear about The Shining is that it, and particularly Nicholson's performance, lacks subtlety. But subtlety can take different shapes. Nicholson is always a big presence as Torrance, but it's nuanced as the events around him unfold quietly. He just continues to ramp it up again and again. Take for example the interview. Before it begins, Ullman asks for Bill Watson to join. Nothing irregular there, he could be the second interviewer, but he settles down next to Jack rather than opposite him as you may expect on an interview panel, and he remains silent as Ullman begins the interview. This sequence alone could be analysed for hours. Take for example the very first thing Ullman asks Jack.
Did they give you any idea in Denver about what the job entails?
Only in a very general way.
The role is to become the caretaker over the closed season of the hotel. Jack explains that the isolation will be perfect for him as he is trying to finish his writing. But remember, this is not a caretaker by trade, and he's learnt very little about the job back in Denver, and yet he has taken the trip all the way out to the hotel on very little knowledge of the position to undertake a role he has no experience in. It's almost as if he's been drawn there. And as Ullman explains the mundane tasks involved in the position, Jack's only responses are very generic.
Not for me.
He doesn't respond in a way of someone vying for the position. There's a sense that he already has it, and it's more a question of whether he will take it, and there is no reluctance on his part.
Well, that just happens to be exactly what I'm looking for. I'm outlining a new writing project, and 5 months of peace is just what I want.
There are no questions about his ability to undertake the physical work, but there is a whole lot of attention paid to the potential effects that solitude and isolation can have on the mental well-being, not just of Jack, but also his wife Wendy and son Danny. So many moments in The Shining have now become iconic and ingrained in the public consciousness that it can be difficult to absorb just how off-kilter this conversation is. Imagine attending an interview, receiving no real questioning behind your past experiences in the field, and then being told about the mental strain that accepting the job may have on you. Any sane, sentient being would run a mile, and yet there's Jack, smiling, without a care in the world. And then, in keeping with the whole carefree vibe of the interview, Ullman nonchalantly drops in the tale of Charles Grady.
Well, before I turn you over to Bill, there's one other thing I think we should talk about. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but it's something that's been known to give a few people second thoughts about the job.
I'm intrigued.
I don't suppose they told you anything in Denver about the tragedy we had up here during the winter of 1970?
I don't believe they did.
Well, my predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker. And he came up here with his wife and two little girls, I think about 8 and 10. And he had a good employment record, good references. And from what I've been told, I mean, he seemed like a completely normal individual. But at some point during the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He ran amok and killed his family with an axe.
And Jack's response? To crack a joke, and even go as far as to say his wife will be thrilled by the idea.
I also understand why your people in Denver left it for you to tell me.
Well, obviously, I mean, some people can be put off by the idea of staying alone at a place where something like that actually happened.
Well, you can rest assured, Mr. Ullman, that's not going to happen with me. And as far as my wife is concerned, I'm sure she'll be absolutely fascinated when I tell her about it. She's a confirmed ghost story and horror film addict.
The mysterious Bill Watson sat next to Jack. The atypical interview techniques, the mystique behind the position itself, Jack's unrelenting willingness to take on the role, the Grady story, the misplaced jokes, even the phone call after the interview where Jack almost forgets to mention he even gets the job, as if there was never any question about it.
Sounds like you got the job?
Right.
It is all these smaller parts that add up to the greater whole with The Shining. Kubrick has meticulously considered every aspect, and it's not about watching the effects on the family, it is about the effects on us as a viewer. It's what sets Kubrick apart from anybody else. The first time we see the family all together is in the car, again hurtling towards the Overlook. There already seems to be a slight change in Jack, his steely determination on the road, the slight frown. If you juxtapose that with the hint of trepidation on Wendy's face, or listen again to the conversations Jack has with his young son, it is clear something is just not right about this situation.
What was the Donner Party?
They were a party of settlers in covered wagon times. They got snowbound one winter in the mountains. They had to resort to cannibalism in order to stay alive.
You mean they ate each other up?
They had to, in order to survive.
Jack, don't worry, Mom. I know all about cannibalism. I saw it on TV.
See? It's okay. You saw it on the television.
After the family arrive at the hotel, they are given a look around, and it's here that Danny meets Halloran. But before they sit down and have a proper conversation, Halloran is already talking to Danny.
We got 60 boxes of dried milk, 30 12-pound bags of sugar, and a dozen 25-pound bags of flour.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?
It is here that we begin to understand exactly what The Shining is. Danny and Halloran possess a power unique to them and few others. At first it all seems fairly harmless. How cool would it be to speak to one another through telepathy? For the second time in only a short few minutes, that underlying darkness seeps into the conversation.
Has Tony ever told you anything about this place? About the Overlook Hotel?
I don't know.
Now think real hard, Doc. Think.
Is there something bad here?
It is this unrelenting horror bleeding into the viewer's mind that is what sets The Shining apart. Kubrick's genius here is his unparalleled skill in scene composition. There are standout moments of pure horror in The Shining, but the moments that stick in the memory are the unassuming sequences. When I think of The Shining, the first image that pops into my head is in the following scene as we cut to a month later and Danny is riding his tricycle through the lobby of the hotel. The script-to-screen translation of this scene alone is mind-blowing. Every single decision made is meticulous in its attempt to extract as much from a standalone moment. Danny's erratic feet pedaling away as his head slightly tilts from side to side, the camera trailing behind him as if it's the same presence lurking over the car at the beginning. The softness of the sound as Danny cycles over the carpet, a cover of what's beneath if you will, followed by the harshness of the underlying wooded floor as Danny inches closer to what's below the surface. The Shining is a film that improves upon each viewing. When paying closer attention, it's staggering how each scene appears to fold into the next. There are of course buzzwords when it comes to the film that invoke a certain image in your head: door, bourbon, maze, but what's incredible is how each sequence feels natural to the flow of the film rather than these big standout moments we expect them to be. Following Danny's tricycle ride, Kubrick continues to slowly follow each member of the family around the vast hotel, and everything they do is tinged with a confusion or an ease. But Kubrick never loses sight of his main focus in this story: us, the viewer. Long before we get to the revelations of Jack, Kubrick is letting us know with every tool at his disposal. There's no overstating the power of the score, for example. As Jack throws a tennis ball against the inner walls, there are all manner of strings and effects that give off the impression of something worming its way around the halls, the camera lurking behind him, doubly adding to this effect. And of course, the great mystery of the film: what happened to that tennis ball? And as Jack looks over the model replica of the maze, Kubrick pulls an astonishing cut as the camera slowly draws into Wendy and Danny within the maze itself. We're not 30 minutes into the film at this point, and nothing explicitly terrifying has happened, and yet all of these aspects combined, the stories, the camera movements, the score, the edits, it's without question for me the single greatest example of horror foreshadowing in any film. The Exorcist deserves a mention for the Iraq sequence and the whole Reagan transformation, but is far less layered. Friedkin is famous for his documentary approach. Kubrick couldn't be further from that, but what you see in the first 30 minutes of The Shining is the apex of what we think of when we say the first act. Not only is the plot working, but the film techniques around it are carrying us through. It's extraordinary. The closing of the first act culminates with Danny discovering room 237. His shining abilities are beginning to draw him into the inner workings of the mystery within the hotel, but brilliantly Kubrick doesn't reveal all. Instead we cut to Jack, typing away. Crucially again, the shot is from behind Jack, but it's slowly panning in towards him. His erratic typing almost drowns out the score as Wendy, full of innocence, enters the frame with her chirpy presence. This is the first of a few expertly performed scenes between Nicholson and Duvall, but here Duvall steals the show. Wendy's look of fear as Jack begins to scream at her tells us so much about her character. There's a sense that she overcompensates with her pleasantries because she has seen before how enraged Jack can become. Just one look in her face and you see a small lifetime of fear in her eyes. And this too is why Nicholson's performance is so important. Clearly his character has this in him. We have to believe this for the story not to become a campy psycho story. But here he's still showing a certain measure of control that hasn't completely escaped him like it does later. But don't get me wrong, he's still horrible.
Yeah. Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Okay.
And then the snow falls, the world around them is cut off, and things start to turn. Everything begins to take a slightly darker edge now. Danny's visions become far more vivid and horrifying, and the plot itself begins to lean into much darker territory. The themes of abuse towards Danny are most definitely there. There's of course whatever happens to him in room 237, but what's more horrifying is the distance in the relationship between Danny and his father. As Jack ushers Danny towards his bed, and the faraway look in Danny's eyes as his dad holds him, the implication of what may have happened here is far more sinister. We get Jack's unreliable version of events later on, but who's to say what really happened, which is of course a common theme across the film. And it's this idea of abuse that finally brings all of the individual characters together. As Wendy tends to Jack, who has awoken from a terrifying nightmare, Danny slowly enters the scene, thumb in mouth with scratches down his face. Amazingly, this is the very first time we see all three family members in the same room together in the hotel. Wendy even tells Danny to go. Those few fleeting moments where Wendy and Danny play outside in the maze or snow, Jack is never there. In isolation, Jack is slowly ebbing away, but the tipping point in the film comes when this family finally comes together in the lobby. It's almost as if the film tells them they should have stayed the hell away from each other. Wendy of course reacts to Danny's injuries in the way any loving mother would. She throws accusations at the only person in the hotel who has a history of abuse and has shown aggression towards her already. That's one important point about the film. As crazy as things can become, we always have the grounding of Wendy. All of her decisions are in keeping with reality, no matter how demented everything becomes around her. And whilst the panic sets in for Wendy, we watch as Jack's confusion tips over into anger right in front of us. It's then at this point that we enter into a new realm within the film. The slow fade to the crisp golden wallpapered corridor as Jack bursts into the frame is almost as if he's ripped into another time and dimension, and in his mind he absolutely has. When commentators accuse The Shining of lacking subtlety, it's because we're honing in on this huge performance in front of us, but the way in which the hotel begins to transform around Jack as he slips out of reality is absolutely fascinating. And as he wanders into the gold room, he switches on the lights as the bar is illuminated and so enticing in front of him. We watch as he makes his way across the room, how the whole place seems set out for a big celebration, almost a welcoming party of some kind. And when he sits down at the bar and puts his head in his hands, he gives the game up.
For a drink. Give my goddamn soul just a glass of beer.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
And with no frills, Kubrick simply cuts to Lloyd in, for me, one of the most unsettling moments in the film. This technique harks back to the post-Stargazer sequence in 2001. It is just as dissociative and disorientating. Nicholson and Joe Tuchel play it pitch perfectly. There's no shock on Torrance's face as there was only moments ago when Danny wandered in. Lloyd has the demeanour of your average hotel bartender. Kubrick understood the only way to demonstrate that Jack has completely tipped over the edge was to play everything utterly straight. In lesser hands, Lloyd would be this zombie-type figure, or Jack would jump out of his seat when he appears, but not here. He laughs such a belly laugh at odds with what went on only a few moments before, and he even knows Lloyd by name. It's so much more effective. And as Wendy re-emerges to deliver the news about Danny and the lady in room 237, there's almost a moment of ironic light relief for the audience.
Jack, there's someone else in the hotel with us. There's a crazy woman in one of the rooms. She tried to strangle Danny.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
But Kubrick quickly disarms you again in the following scene. All the tricks he's been pulling on the audience throughout now become Jack's reality. How we look at a room and think something doesn't quite look right. How Danny on a tricycle has a peculiar aura. The weird cuts. We as an audience have been privy to the mysteries of the hotel ever since Danny saw the twins on the first day. But now Jack starts talking to imaginary bartenders. And then he steps into room 237. Whenever anyone asks me what is my favourite sequence in any Kubrick film, I think two things. First, how can I possibly answer that? And secondly, when I always come up with the same answer, how can I tell them it's the lady in the bathtub sequence in The Shining without sounding like a complete psychopath? Well, the cat's out the bag now, so allow me to explain. For me, it feels like the quintessential Kubrick moment. The greatest directors always have terms of reference, Fellini-esque, Lynchian. But when I think Kubrickian, I think bold colours and patterns, measured Steadicam movements, vast rooms housing dark corners, and cold, clinical execution to everything. And never is that truer than when Jack walks into room 237. The creeping dread as we cut to Jack's face, the pullback of the curtain to reveal the beautiful woman in the bathtub, and that slow methodical way in which he stands up and begins to approach Jack. The darkness in his tipped eyes, that maniacal face that suggests 1,000 dark thoughts, the embrace as the score screeches, and that instant switch to the mirror. It's horrifying in a visual sense, but what's more is the way in which this slow approach burns its way into the psyche of the viewer. Kubrick is painting a terrifying scene in your mind, frame by frame, creating a set of visuals that are impossible to forget. There's no modern day jump scare. It's the polar opposite. It's pure terror without any flashy tricks, just a control and understanding of how to transmit scares across to the audience in its purest form, and it's without question one of the most shocking moments in the film. It's also at this point here where Danny begins to shine to Halloran, beginning his long journey back to the Overlook Hotel. One of the most jarring points of the film, and the ultimate confirmation that Jack has now gone and isn't coming back, is how he responds to what he has just seen. For reasons that you or I cannot compute, he reassures Wendy that there is nothing in the room, and in fact Danny may have done this to himself. Wendy of course cannot comprehend this, and the big elephant in the room is that there's only one other realistic explanation for what has happened. And the way Wendy treads on eggshells around what she's thinking is so tense. She has a fairly solid idea of what the truth is, and yet she's no one to turn to. Her first thought is protecting her baby, and the man who should be helping her is the one she is most afraid of. This is the undercurrent that sets The Shining apart from any of the other haunted house type movies. The true horror is much closer to home. The way Jack manipulates Wendy. For all the iconic set pieces, it's these quieter moments of mental abuse towards her that can be the most shocking. Nicholson is such an incredible presence, it's sometimes hard to see the story from Wendy's perspective, but to do so is where the film takes on a whole other edge of horror. And Wendy's worst thoughts are confirmed as within an instant Jack snaps. The way Nicholson contorts his face from one of mock sympathy into sheer rage is almost as if he's being possessed right there in front of you. We get the now famous cuts to Danny's fears and blood running down the elevator doors into the corridor as the music reaches another crescendo. The more Jack gives himself over to the hotel, the more it breathes. It's as if his life force is draining into the walls until we finally return to the Gold Room where that welcoming party is in full flight. This is another stunning sequence. It looks beautiful for starters as the ghosts of the past sit across the vast room in their tuxedos and dresses. Jack of course heads straight to the bar, and for the second time in the same location, he gives the game up yet again.
Hi, Lloyd. Been away, but now I'm back.
Good evening, Mr. Torrance. It's good to see you.
It's good to be back, Lloyd.
Of course, Jack doesn't get much of a chance to enjoy the party as he immediately bumps into a waiter, knocking his drink all over him and requiring a clean-up from Jeeves's old pal. I'm running out of superlatives here. It's just one perfectly executed sequence after another. As the waiter begins to mop up the spilt drink, the conversation, ever so slowly, begins to take a dark turn, followed by another dark turn. First we learn that the waiter in question goes by the name of Grady. I absolutely adore the way in which Nicholson performs this scene. His character has completely lost his mind by this point, and here he is having a conversation with the ghost, but his demeanour is an all, I know what's going on here. The first few moments of the scene are, at least on repeated viewings, a lot of fun, as we just watch this cocky, smarmy attitude from Jack against this cold precision of Grady. But as the conversation continues, it just gets more and more menacing. The way in which Grady quietly, delicately tends to Jack as he's pressed on his family, and then the real mystery of the film comes into play.
That's strange, sir. I don't have any recollection of that at all.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker here.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
As Grady becomes utterly sinister, he warns Jack of Danny's abilities and how he has shined to Halloran. It's fascinating to watch as Jack now settles into this role that he's apparently always been, the caretaker. It goes back to that interview at the beginning of the film and how he always seemed to have this job, how despite his best efforts, he'll never be a writer here. He is the caretaker. And from this moment out, the father is gone, the husband is gone, the failed writer is gone. The caretaker is here. And how little does Halloran know as he makes his way back to the hotel. This seems like a good junction to talk about the whole Kubrick versus King story that played out following the release of the film. As Halloran makes his way through the snow, he passes a crushed red beetle. The theory is that because the red beetle is the car driven by Jack in the novel, whereas in the film he drives the yellow one, this is Kubrick's way of saying to King that this is my movie and not your novel. King took great umbrage at this and has famously disregarded the film ever since. I don't know how much truth is in any of that, but as the line goes, there's nothing in a Kubrick film that isn't intentional. And I don't think there's any problem with that. Kubrick makes films, and he often takes his source from somebody else's novel. He faced similar instances with Arthur C. Clarke around 2001, but the most important thing is that Kubrick made, and we got, the film he wanted to make. There is an adapted TV miniseries from Mick Garris, another famous dissenting voice about this movie, that sticks much closer to the original novel, but there's no debate in which adaptation is more successful, regardless of how closely it sticks to the source. Kubrick was right with every decision he made in this film, even if he does stick a little dig in at King. In the next scene, we cut back to Wendy, brandishing a bat. After Jack's outbursts before, she's now in no doubt that there is something extremely troubling going on in his head. But she's about to get the scariest reveal of just how far off the track he has gone. As she looks down at the hundreds of pages he's typed out for the book, we get one of the most quietly effective scares in cinema history. and then the face-off. Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall give the career best in this film, and this scene is the apex of their performances. Kubrick is absolutely devoted to Duvall's face in this scene as she pulls back from the camera, the sheer horror on her face at what is going through her mind at this moment, the realisation that this man in her presence has become completely insane, and that she has absolutely no escape. Nicholson stalks her, mocking her, screaming at her wildly as Danny shines every step of the confrontation. The way Kubrick continues to cut between the points of view of both Jack and Wendy, slowly pulling and pushing the camera towards and away from them, the film is alive with the tension of the scene. Duvall in particular is incredible. Throughout the entire film she is being this timid, shy but polite young woman who clearly loves both her husband and child, and she's done absolutely nothing wrong but try and care for both of them. As she ascends the stairs, you feel for her so much because she is the purest sense of innocence, but now a complete mess as this man she no longer recognises almost plays with her fragility. Thankfully she gets in a lucky swing, but now she understands the situation clearly. It's a race against time to get out of here and away from Jack. But after locking Jack in the pantry, he awakes with a little message.
I'm gonna go now. I'm gonna try to get Danny down to Sidewinder and the Snowcat today. I'll bring back a doctor.
Wendy?
I'm gonna go now.
Wendy?
Yes.
You got a big surprise coming to you. You're not going anywhere. Go check out the Snowcat in the radio and you'll see what I mean. Go check it out. Go check it out. Go check it out.
As Halloran eventually makes the final part of his journey back to the Overlook, Grady mysteriously reappears and does Jack a little favour by unlocking the pantry doors, allowing him to escape. And now, all bets are off. The caretaker is coming for his family. As Danny's little friend Tony delivers a message to a sleeping Wendy, the terror takes a turn for the even more real.
Red rum. 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 Stop it. Red rum. Red rum. Red rum.
Maybe the most iconic scene in the whole film thanks to the famous "Here's Johnny" line, but in a way the notoriety of that line undoubtedly takes a little power from the scene. It's one of those moments like "Luke, I am your father" that has become more famous than the film itself, and unfortunately, like Empire Strikes Back, it's also a major spoiler for the film, because every conversation around it will start along the lines of, "Hey, that's great," when he starts smashing the door in with an axe to get to his wife and child and he's saying, "Here's Johnny." If you know that going into the film, it's going to take a little shine off the build-up, no pun intended. But that's not a fault of the movie. It's just a shame that this movie won't quite be able to carry the same unknowing it had upon its release. It's very similar in that sense again to The Exorcist. Everyone knows about the pea soup or spinning head, but there's a whole world of terror built up around those moments. But equally to The Exorcist, The Shining still manages to retain its power regardless of the spoilers. And that's why those two horror films resonate above all others. And the scene is another petrifying moment. As Danny escapes through the window, there is nowhere left to turn for Wendy. She sacrificed herself in the hope of saving her child, but the lunatic outside her bathroom swinging the axe is inching closer to getting to her, and Kubrick has us along for every single swing. It's yet another demonstration of his understanding of how to compose the scene. You could genuinely take any single frame from this scene and it would highlight the sheer anxiety and terror of what's going on. Duvall again is on another level. I know she was pretty tormented on the set by Kubrick, and whilst analysis of whether that is right or wrong I'll leave to someone far more informed on the subject than me to comment, what I will say is, however it was achieved, she never puts a foot wrong in this film. Her acceleration of dread is equal to the gathering psychoses in Nicholson's Jack. Next time you stick the film on, pause this scene at any moment and you'll see those two complete performances boiled down to this finite detail. As the film draws to its final 20 minutes and Halloran's arrival, the less experienced viewer would probably expect everything to go a certain way, but true to the form of the film, it just ramps up again. Nicholson still has some loony juice left in the tank for the final showdown in the maze, but Kubrick too just goes all in at the end. I should make a point that there is of course at least 2 different cuts of the film, and to my memory most of the additional content is in this section at the end, but we get all manner of craziness going on here. The bunny bear thing, let's move on. The party goer with the cracked head, the blood. One thing that doesn't come off often about Kubrick's films is the editing. It's almost as if its greatness goes without saying, but I think some of his best work is here, in these final moments of The Shining. As Danny is chased by Jack in the maze, we continue to cut back to Wendy's own sprint through the hotel, but it's not only that. The way in which we cut from Danny to Jack and how the point of view of Jack seems to speed up as if signifying his manic state. And there is of course the famous jump cut to round things out. I've purposely avoided talking about the central mystery of The Shining, what it all means, because frankly I don't know. Kubrick leaves enough little hints in there to trigger theories across the board, many of which you'll have heard before, but my opinion is that it's not one definitive thing, and that Kubrick left those aspects in to enliven the legacy of the film. After you've spent a lifetime dissecting what is in the movie, good news folks, you can start dissecting what isn't in it too. And that for me is what sets The Shining apart and will continue to set it apart. No matter what came before or what comes after, there will always be a space for The Shining. Is it the greatest horror film ever made? Who knows? It's in the list. But what I do think is indisputable is it is the best made film that operates in the horror genre. Regardless of what came before or what will come after, The Shining will always be in the conversation, because of the way that it is constructed. You can watch it once and take a million things from it. You can watch it 100 times and take yet more. If you can return to it and find something new in it every single time, that is a special film. Thanks for watching.